Have you ever truly stopped to wonder, what if death isn't the end of life, but its destination? Not a failure, not a punishment, but a sacred arrival? We spend so much of our lives avoiding death. We push it into silence, tuck it behind hospital doors, sanitize it with clinical language, or deny it altogether with phrases like, "You have so much life ahead of you. Think positive," or "Don't be morbid." But beneath all that denial, isn't there a quiet truth whispering in the background? A truth that one day, everything we've built, everyone we've loved, every thought we've ever had, will dissolve into something unknown. And most of us, if we're honest, are afraid of that. Not necessarily afraid of dying painfully, but of disappearing, of becoming nothing, of not mattering, of not knowing what comes next. And yet, Carl Jung, one of the most profound voices in the history of modern psychology, offers a very different vision. He didn't run from death. He sat with it. He studied it. He even, for a brief moment, entered it. And what he found wasn't a wall. It was a doorway. Jung believed that death is not the opposite of life. He wrote, "Death is the goal of life. Life's fulfillment lies in its end, not in a tragic way, not as something to be feared, but as something that gives life its meaning, its structure, its shape." For Jung, death wasn't a glitch in the system. It was part of the system. It was a natural, even necessary, completion to the journey of the soul. He viewed the psyche not as something that ended with the body, but as something that moved through stages: birth, development, integration, and finally, release. Just as the seed contains the tree, and the tree drops its leaves in autumn, so too does the soul carry its own arc. A cycle. Not a flat line with a sharp drop, but a spiral, a deepening. And at the heart of that spiral is death. If you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, or even beyond, you might be feeling that shift. Not necessarily a fear of dying tomorrow, but a sense that time is moving differently now, that the questions you once avoided are now pressing closer. Who am I really? Have I lived in alignment with who I truly am? What will be left of me when I'm gone? You're not alone in asking these things. Jung called this phase the afternoon of life, and he warned us, the rules that got you through the morning no longer apply here. In the first half of life, we strive to build careers, families, identities. We chase goals, we compete, we prove ourselves. But in the second half, if we are to remain alive, truly alive, something must change. The focus must shift inward. We must begin the journey back home, to the soul, to the truth, to the self. And death, it is not the punishment for living. It is the final test of how deeply we've learned to live truthfully. It's the culmination of individuation, the psychological and spiritual process of becoming whole. But we can't even begin that process if we keep running from the one thing waiting patiently for us all. Death doesn't knock loudly. It waits quietly, not to haunt you, but to invite you into a deeper kind of awareness, a slower breath, a more conscious moment, a softer presence with yourself and others. So, what would happen if we finally stopped pushing death away? What if we looked at it not as an enemy, but as a teacher? What if we stopped whispering about it in fear and began having the real conversation? That's what we'll explore in this video. Not in theory, not in drama, but with depth, with honesty, and with the wisdom Jung spent a lifetime uncovering. If you've ever felt like something inside you is quietly preparing, if you've sensed a calling you couldn't name, if you've felt that maybe, just maybe, death isn't the end, but the completion of something profound, then stay with me, because you're exactly where you're meant to be. We often think of death as the opposite of life, like black against white, silence against music, absence against presence. But Carl Jung challenged that thought in his writings. He said something deeply provocative. Death is not the opposite of life. Death is the opposite of birth. Life has no opposite. It is a continuum. This changes everything, because in that one statement, Jung lifts death out of the shadows of fear and places it gently in the rhythm of existence, like sunrise and sunset, like inhale and exhale. Death is not a rupture. It's a return. Jung saw life as a psychic journey, a movement of the soul toward wholeness, not perfection. And in that journey, death wasn't some final erasure or cruel punishment. It was a phase, a sacred turning point, a release into something broader than the individual self. He compared the psyche to a circle, a mandala, not a straight line, from cradle to grave, but a cycle, a spiral of inner integration, always pointing towards something deeper. And in that spiral, death wasn't an interruption. It was the final curve where ego fades and the self emerges in its full light. Called this the process of individuation. And to him, death was its completion, not its contradiction. It's easy to misunderstand that. Some might think that individuation means becoming more successful, more stable, more admired. But Jung wasn't concerned with success in the worldly sense. He was concerned with truth, with helping the soul return to itself. In the first half of life, most of us are consumed by what Jung called the ego task. We build identities, define ourselves, achieve goals, form relationships, accumulate things. And all of that is important. It gives shape to who we are in the world. But then, somewhere along the way, usually in midlife or later, something begins to shift. The ego's ambitions no longer satisfy. The outer world begins to lose its grip on our sense of meaning. And suddenly, what once made us feel alive, praise, status, busyness, starts to feel hollow. That's the moment Jung was speaking. 2. He believed that the second half of life demands something else entirely. Integration. A return to the inner world, to the soul, to the unconscious. And as we approach the end of our physical life, that invitation becomes louder, more urgent, more sacred. Jung observed this not just in theory, but in the dreams of his patients, in the art they created, in the quiet longings they could never quite name. He saw that many people, especially as they aged, were not afraid of dying, but of dying unfinished, of leaving this world without having returned to their essence, of never really having known who they were beneath all the masks. He once wrote, "The goal of the individuation process is the synthesis of the self, that which we are meant to become." And to Jung, death was the final movement of that synthesis, the moment where the boundaries between ego and self dissolve, and the psyche is freed from form, not to vanish, but to become whole. Imagine a river flowing toward the ocean. At first, it fights to define its own path, cutting through rocks, carving valleys, seeking identity. But in the end, it returns not with defeat, but with fulfillment to the vast sea from which it came. This is how Jung saw death. Not as loss, but as homecoming. If you're listening to this, and you're in a stage of life where you feel something shifting, where old goals don't spark the same fire, where you crave silence over noise, truth over appearance. You're not falling behind. You're being called inward, called not to die, but to begin understanding what death really is. A movement, a passage, a revelation. Jung wasn't trying to romanticize death. He respected its mystery. He knew it wasn't something we could fully grasp. But he also knew this: death is psychologically as important as birth, and like it, an integral part of life. So when we fear death, perhaps what we're really afraid of is not death itself, but what we've left unlived, the words we never spoke, the truths we never honored, the parts of ourselves we never dared to reclaim. Carl Jung's voice reaches across time to remind us: death is not our enemy. It's not a punishment. It's a mirror, and it will reflect back to us the life we've truly lived. Not the one we've shown the world, but the one we've built in silence, choice by choice, shadow by shadow, truth by truth. In the next part of this journey, we'll explore the process of individuation more deeply, and how death marks not a collapse of the self, but the final step in its integration. If you've ever felt like death is calling you not with fear, but with curiosity, not with finality, but with invitation, then you're already walking the sacred path Jung spoke of. You're not dying, you're becoming. What if the purpose of life was never to be perfect, but to become whole? That is the essence of Carl Jung's concept of individuation. And to understand how Jung viewed death, we must first understand this process, because in his eyes, death is not the enemy of individuation. It is its completion. Individuation is not about self-improvement in the way modern culture defines it. It's not about becoming better, faster, or more productive. It's about becoming more deeply yourself, not the version shaped by others. Not the mask worn for survival, but the true, integrated self that has always been waiting beneath the surface. Jung described individuation as the soul's journey toward unity, a unifying of opposites, the conscious and the unconscious, the light and the shadow, the masculine and the feminine, the ego and the self. It is a sacred return to inner wholeness. And death, to Jung, was not the undoing of that work. It was the culmination. In his book Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung reflected deeply on his own experiences of aging and approaching death. He wrote not with panic or denial, but with clarity and even a kind of wonder. He saw that those who resisted individuation often entered their later years with confusion, anxiety, or despair, because they had spent so long developing a persona, that when the persona began to fall apart, as it must, their sense of identity collapsed with it. But those who had done the inner work, those who had looked into their own shadows, reconciled with their past, honored their deeper truth, they entered old age and death not with fear, but with reverence. For Jung, death was not the falling away of identity. It was the arrival at the self. Let's pause for a moment here. Have you ever felt, in a quiet moment, maybe while walking in nature or lying awake in the dark, that something inside you is longing to be known? Not by others, but by you? That sense of being called inward, that subtle discomfort with surface-level living, that's the beginning of individuation. And once it begins, it doesn't let go, because the self longs to be realized. And when it's denied, it whispers. It disrupts. It appears in dreams, in restlessness, in unexpected breakdowns that are actually breakthroughs in disguise. In his later years, Jung had a near-death experience after suffering a heart attack. He described it vividly. He found himself floating far above the earth, detached from his body, watching the planet from a great distance. He saw the curve of the earth, the vast expanse of blue, and he felt peace. He felt himself slipping into another reality, a greater consciousness. He described it not as frightening, but as unspeakably beautiful, as if he were being welcomed home. But before he could fully pass over, he was told it was not his time. He returned to his body, but the experience stayed with him. Afterward, he no longer feared death. He saw it not as an ending, but as a continuation, a passage into another form of existence, one that the ego could never comprehend, but the self deeply understood. Jung often used symbolism and dreams to express truths that language couldn't capture. He saw death as an archetypal transition, one that appears in myth, in religion, in dreams across every culture. In dream analysis, he noticed how people nearing death often dreamt of crossing rivers, passing through doors, or meeting guides. They weren't afraid. They were preparing. And their unconscious mind, far wiser than the intellect, was leading the way. This tells us something important. The soul knows how to die, just as the body knows how to heal a wound. The psyche knows how to cross thresholds, but we must listen. We must allow ourselves to be led. And individuation, in its most spiritual sense, is the practice of listening, of turning inward long before death comes knocking. Jung believed that the greatest tragedy of modern life is not death itself, but that so many people reach death without ever having truly lived. Not lived in the external sense, but lived as themselves. He saw the human being not as a problem to be fixed, but as a mystery to be uncovered. And death? Death was the final unfolding of that mystery, the last petal of a lifelong bloom. There's a powerful line from Jung where he says, "A human being would certainly not grow to be 70 or 80 years old if this longevity had no meaning for the species. The afternoon of life must have a significance of its own and cannot be merely a pitiful appendage to life's morning." Think about that. The second half of life, often feared, dismissed, hidden away, is actually the most sacred time for individuation. And approaching death is not the end of your story. It's the moment the story finally comes into focus. If you're listening to this and you're in that afternoon of life, you may already sense this truth. You may feel less driven by ambition and more drawn to meaning. You may find yourself revisiting memories, questioning old beliefs, letting go of roles you once clung to. This is not regression. It is the soul preparing to integrate, to complete its arc, to come home to itself. Individuation doesn't mean perfection. It doesn't mean enlightenment. It simply means I am no longer running from who I am. And when you reach that place, when you stop editing yourself to be acceptable, when you stop splitting yourself into good and bad, success and failure, strong and weak, you become whole. And wholeness is the only thing the soul can carry beyond the grave. So Jung asks us, gently but firmly, before your body dies, can you allow your false selves to die first? Can you begin the work now, so that when the moment comes, you meet death not as a stranger, but as an old friend? A closing breath, a final integration. Not the end of you, but the arrival of who you've been becoming all along. We live in a culture obsessed with youth. We inject it, edit it, idolize it. We cling to the morning of life and pretend the afternoon isn't coming. Death in this world is the great unwelcome guest. We don't talk about it, not around the dinner table, not in polite conversation, not even with ourselves. It hovers in hospital rooms and behind funeral curtains, hidden in euphemisms like passed away or gone to a better place. But Carl Jung saw this avoidance not as harmless. He saw it as psychological danger. It is only when we accept death as part of life, he wrote, that we begin to live fully. To Jung, repressing the reality of death wasn't just a cultural flaw. It was a recipe for emotional distortion, even neurosis. When we push death into the shadows, we also push away our own depth, our own vulnerability, our own humanity. Because whether we admit it or not, death shapes everything. Think about it. Would love be as precious if it could last forever? Would time matter if it were infinite? Would a single sunrise be so moving if there weren't a final one waiting in the distance? It's not death that makes life meaningless. It's death that gives life its urgency, its color, its texture, its weight. Jung believed that death functions like a mirror. It reflects back to us the question we spend most of our lives avoiding. Am I really living? Not, am I busy? Not, am I successful? But, am I connected to what truly matters? This question doesn't arise when we run from death. It only arises when we sit still long enough to feel its presence. And make no mistake, death is always present. Not in a haunting way, but in a grounding way. Like the roots beneath a tree you can't see, but without which nothing would stand. Many of Jung's patients, especially those in midlife and beyond, came to him not because they feared death, but because they had never made peace with it. They were haunted not by dying, but by dying before they had truly lived. They had followed the rules, built the career, raised the family, but somewhere deep inside, they knew something was unfinished. They had postponed their soul, and that haunting, it often shows up not in screaming, but in silence, in anxiety, in emptiness, in that quiet ache that says, there has to be more than this. Jung saw that making peace with death didn't make life darker. It made it clearer. It helped his patients recenter, prioritize, rediscover meaning. One man, nearing the end of his life, told Jung, I finally feel like I'm not wasting time anymore. Why? Because death was no longer abstract. It was real, and realness brings clarity. You may have felt it too, in a diagnosis, a funeral, a brush with danger. Suddenly, life sharpens. You start to notice how someone holds your hand, how the wind touches your skin, how your breath slows when you're truly listening. That's not morbid. That's awakening. And death, when acknowledged, not obsessed over, not dramatized, but faced, becomes a kind of secret alarm clock. It rings not to scare you, but to wake you up. Jung didn't urge people to dwell on death. He didn't believe in nihilism or gloom. He simply believed in wholeness, and wholeness means nothing is left out. Not your joy, not your pain, and not your death. Because to exclude death is to build a life that floats above itself, disconnected, anxious, unrooted. A life where time is wasted because it's taken for granted. But when death is welcomed into consciousness, not as a threat, but as a companion, something profound happens. Your choices become more honest. Your relationships become more precious. And your sense of self begins to deepen. So if you've been afraid to think about death, If you've pushed it away because it makes your chest tighten or your eyes sting, know this: that fear is not a weakness. It's a doorway to deeper love, deeper clarity, and a life more fully lived. Carl Jung believed that to live meaningfully, we must not run from the end. We must let it guide us, gently, honestly, quietly, like a lantern in the dark. N. The next part of this journey will explore the power of story and how Jung believed each of us needs a personal myth about death to face it with peace. Because without meaning, death feels like destruction. But with meaning, death becomes transformation. And that changes everything. Not everyone needs a religion, but everyone, Jung believed, needs a myth. Not a fantasy, not a superstition, but a living, breathing inner image, a story that gives meaning to our ending. Because without meaning, death feels like destruction. But with meaning, death becomes transformation. Carl Jung once wrote, "A man cannot live meaningfully without a myth of death. He must imagine what he is moving toward." And that word imagine is the key. He wasn't telling us to know exactly what happens after we die. No one does. But he was urging us to listen to something older than logic and more intuitive than intellect. Our soul's imagination. You see, the conscious mind demands certainty. What happens when I die? Is there a heaven? Is there nothing? Will I remember anything? But the unconscious doesn't speak in facts. It speaks in symbols, in dreams, in deep feelings that bypass explanation but resonate as true. That's why Jung believed that the soul needs a story, not to escape death, but to enter it with reverence. In the absence of that myth, we are left to wander through life with a ticking clock and no map. And the result? Anxiety, disconnection, a frantic clinging to the physical, as if the soul has no shape beyond flesh. But when you have a myth, when you carry an inner vision of what death means for you, you begin to live differently. You stop clinging. You start listening. For Jung, the myth of death didn't come from books or doctrines. It came from the unconscious, from dreams, synchronicities, archetypes that emerge from within. He saw this time and again in his patients. People who had never thought deeply about death would, as they aged, begin having vivid symbolic dreams, crossing rivers, walking through doors, climbing toward distant lights, hearing music from beyond a veil. These were not hallucinations. They were not signs of delusion. They were the soul's way of preparing. Jung once told a story of a woman who, in the last months of her life, dreamt of building a small wooden boat by a lake. Each night, she dreamt of adding one more piece. When she finally finished it, she said, "Now I can go." That was her myth. Not told to her by a priest or a textbook, but born within her in her own symbolic language. And it gave her peace. So the question is not, what is the truth about death? The real question is, what story helps you live more fully, love more freely, and release more gently? Is it the idea of returning to the stars, reuniting with loved ones, melting back into nature's rhythm, being welcomed by an archetypal guide, or simply finally resting? Whatever it is, if it brings you closer to yourself, then it's not fantasy, it's medicine. Jung wasn't dogmatic. He didn't prescribe one myth. He simply reminded us that we need one, because without a myth, we die into chaos. But with a myth, we die into meaning. And meaning is what the soul craves more than certainty. more than safety. You don't have to believe in an afterlife to create a myth of death. You only have to be willing to ask, what does death symbolize? For me, what image brings me peace? What story feels true not to my ego, but to my deeper self? And then, listen not with your ears, but with your intuition. That story might arrive slowly. In a dream, in a quiet walk through a forest, in the hush of your heart before sleep. Creating a myth of death doesn't mean denying reality. It means adding depth to it, bringing soul to the inevitable, infusing the end with the very meaning that made the journey worth taking. Jung believed that meaning is what saves us from despair, and myth is how the soul speaks that meaning into form. So if you want peace, if you want to face your own death, not with dread, but with dignity, begin listening for the myth that's already blooming inside you. You don't need answers. You only need the courage to imagine, because imagination, when rooted in the soul, is not fiction. It is truth told in symbols. In our final part, we'll explore what happens when this inner work is done, when we stop chasing perfection and begin walking step by step toward wholeness. Because Jung didn't just teach us how to live. He taught us how to die well, with honesty, with meaning, and most of all, with the quiet joy of returning to ourselves. By now, perhaps you've begun to feel it too. That subtle shift in how you see death. Not as a thief in the night, but as a teacher, a guide, a mirror, and ultimately an act of integration, not erasure. Carl Jung never promised that death would be easy, but he did believe it could be meaningful, not just in the way we leave, but in how we arrive into our truest self. To Jung, death was not a collapse. It was the final movement in a symphony that began the day we were born. A return not to nothingness, but to the totality of who we really are. The privilege of a lifetime, he once wrote, is to become who you truly are. And death, in his vision, was the point where the self finally whole, finally at peace, lets go of the small story, and becomes part of the great unfolding. It is not disappearance, it is completion. But here's the truth that often goes unspoken. Most people are not afraid of death itself. They are afraid of dying unfinished, not of reaching the final chapter without ever having read the middle pages, of spending decades avoiding the very questions that give life depth, of leaving this world having never truly come home to themselves. And so Jung's invitation is not simply to reflect on death. It is to live with it in mind, not with fear, but with integrity. To stop pretending we'll live forever and start asking, what does my soul need before I go? That question is not morbid, it is sacred. It realigns us. It simplifies us. It pulls us back from distraction and toward what matters most. It's not too late. It's never too late. Whether you're 30 or 70, whether you're just beginning to turn inward or have been quietly walking this path for years, this is your time. To stop chasing perfection, to stop waiting for permission, to stop being a stranger to your own depth, and instead, to start living as someone who knows. Death is not the opposite of life. It is the moment we finally stop pretending and start remembering who we've always been. So pause right now and take one breath, with full awareness that it won't last forever, and let that truth make it more beautiful, not more frightening. Because when you carry death as a companion, not a curse, you love more honestly, you speak more bravely, you live more fully, You become someone who is not rushing toward the end, but welcoming it step by step, because you have lived aligned with your truth. Maybe that's what it means to die well. Not to have all the answers, but to arrive at the threshold with nothing left to run from and nothing left to prove. Just presence, just peace, just wholeness. If this message touched something in you, if even a part of you whispered, "Yes, I felt this too," then I want to thank you for walking this journey with me. And I invite you now to support this space of reflection. Like this video if it resonated with your soul. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss future explorations on Carl Jung, death, individuation, and the wisdom of the unconscious. And comment below, what does death mean to you today in this season of your life? Because the more we speak about it openly, honestly, without fear, the more we help each other live. In the next video, we'll continue this soul-deep journey with creating a personal myth of death, how to build inner peace through story, an entire episode dedicated to helping you shape your own meaningful myth of what comes after. Until then, breathe deeply, live truthfully, and remember, you are not here to be perfect. You are here to become whole. And that is more than enough.